love it. That's beautiful. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Lucas Holmgren. I'm really happy to have one of my guitar heroes here, John Standefer. And thanks for coming in today, John.
Yeah, you bet.
Appreciate it. If we could maybe go a little bit into your background. And I do want to start with just one question here, which is about your earliest memory of the guitar or anything that can come to mind.
I was born in West Texas. The whole Standefer side of the family all played mandolins and fiddles and guitars and stuff. So, I mean, I was around it, way early. I don't even remember when it was happening when I was in the cradle, But I got interested. It was interesting. There was a marching band. We were 2 blocks down from the high school, and that marching band would walk in front of our house every day. And when they were, and when the weather was good, which is most of the time, and I was so impressed with the last 2 rows of the band, which is the sousaphones and the drums. Just that big, powerful sound. And so. Anyway, I would get out, I was like 5 years old, I'd get out and march in front of the house, with them, and I kind of became their unofficial mascot. And oddly, the kid that lived kitty-cornered across the street, Phil McCurry, was a drummer in that band. And he came to my mom one day and said, hey, I see, John's really interested in music and everything. If you'd like, I could teach him drum lessons. And so she said, sure. And so I got a practice pad and a little snare and some sticks and this and that. And he pulled out the Haskell book, and started teaching me drum rudiments. And I couldn't read English yet, but I was reading left and right stroke marks and quarter notes and eighth notes and all that stuff. And I learned how to play marching drums. And I never forget when I got the double stroke roll, I thought I had, I interrupted their dinner. I ran over there and rang the doorbell and look at this,
That's great.
So anyway, but I got going on drums, but what happened was, by the time I started getting kind of good at it, the family would get together, and they'd pull out all their stringed instruments and everything and start playing, and I'd pull out my drum to join them along, and they'd gradually start putting their instruments away. Because in West Texas, stringed instruments are music, drums are noise. And so anyhow, my Uncle Walter, which I thought was a generous gesture at the time, gave me an old K mandolin. And it wasn't so much that he was giving me a gift; he was trying to get me off those drums. And but I learned how to play, Over the Waves and Ragtime Annie and a few tunes by ear. And when my mom saw that I had a natural knack at it, she said, "Well, he ain't going to be no ignoramus like us, and if he's going to learn it, he's going to learn it right." And you'd never believe this, but in Odessa, Texas, she found a guy named James Gambino, who was a Viennese concertmaster who taught violin and mandolin. And so I took lessons from him, learned how to read notes, I was playing Mozart and Bach and fingering it all right and reading notes and everything. And again, I was just barely old enough. I was starting to read Jane Jump or something, and but that was, and it kept going like that. When 10th grade, or not 10th grade, 5th grade came along, you could do violin in orchestra. And so I figured, well, a fiddle is tuned the same as a mandolin. All I got to do is learn how to bow, and I'll have it, and I'll be the star of the class. So what happened was I got to that class, and none of the other kids even knew which end of the fiddle to hold or anything like that, and I was whacking out tunes, And so the instructor called my mom immediately and said, oh, he would be wasting his time here. He should be taking lessons from the first chair violinist in the symphony. And that's exactly what happened. So I never got to be the star of my class. Instead, I was taking lessons from Dorothy Croft, who was famous in those days for having written the world standard violin theory books. So anyway, and then it just kept going that way. Every instrument that I learned, and right up through guitar and trombone and bass and banjo and everything that I learned, I was playing it by ear and reading notes. And that, I think, is a key element in what makes me what I am today, because if you run onto people who play strictly by ear, they generally have a certain amount that they can get, and then there's a vast amount of stuff that they just can't get.
Yeah.
You know, and so they're limited in what they can do. On the other hand, people that learn how to read notes and do it the right way, they can do incredibly fantastic flying feats, but they can't improvise. They don't have any ability to do anything that isn't written on the page. And I was fortunate enough to be doing both at the same time, so I was exercising both halves of my brain at once, kind of.
Well, that just kind of makes sense, you know, from starting with drums and moving on to, what is it, mandolin and violin and notes and rhythm, you know, all these kind of tools in your toolbox that you have.
Right.
It all came together on the guitar. So aside from, you know, kind of the family jamming and the schooling and everything that you did, when did your life as a guitar player and your career as a guitar player, where did that kind of start out?
Well, it really started, we moved from Texas to Washington State when I was 13. And it's a key time for kids because, you know, you're right at that junior high age and everything where suddenly girls start seeming important and every other thing, you know. And I moved from Texas, and I had a southern accent and wore a hat and boots, and you know, I was in the far outside of the out crowd. So I didn't hardly have any friends at all the way through junior high and high school. I didn't have anything better to do and by then I was just big enough to reach a guitar. And of course, we had guitars at home and everything. My mom had an old Gibson archtop, you know, that I kind of learned on in the beginning. And so but I'll tell you, the first big influence really was Peter, Paul, and Mary, because it was the end of the '60s folk scare, you know, and they were still big, and that finger picking style that they did to accompany themselves. They did a lot of Travis picking and that sort of thing, and you know, it was my first awakening to that, and so I got Peter, Paul, and Mary albums and tried to learn, you know, tunes off of them and all that. So that was the beginning. But then a funny thing happened on the way to the Forum. An old fiddler friend of mine he was 64 and I was 14 by then. He introduced me to this guy named Chet Atkins, and Chet, you know, by then I had listened to the Ventures and the Shadows and Santos and Johnny, and I knew what these guitar bands, you know, sounded like. So I didn't find Chet's band to be that much different than everybody else's. It was good. But then I came home from school one day, and we lived 2 blocks from the junior high. And so school was out at 2:30, and at 2:35 I had a guitar in my hand. And just as I was walking in the door this one day, my mom was watching Mike Douglas, which was an old daytime black and white TV show. And he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Guitar, Chet Atkins." And this funny looking old stick, you know, came out and sat on a chair and everything and started playing. Well, and I thought the same thing as I had thought with what records I'd heard of him up to that point, that, you know, it's a pretty nice little group, you know, and everything. But I did notice that he was the only one out there. But that still didn't faze me, because I thought, well, I know how they do it on TV. You know, he's miming the thing, you know, miming the record, and all the background stuff is coming out of the speakers. And then suddenly the camera shot in just on his hands, and I watched those hands, and I became a finger picker that day. I thought, my God, he's doing all of that by himself on one guitar. And I'd never heard anything like that. So I went running out the back door down to Lightburn's dry goods store to try to see if I could find a Chet Atkins album, and there wasn't any, but they had a Recatron book, and so I ordered a couple. And, you know, in a week or two they came in, and I would sit in my bedroom and I'd put a record on, and every song that ended I'd go, it's impossible. There's like no way can that be done, you know. And anyway, a little at a time, I got up the nerve to try what I thought was the easiest one, and I learned how to play Camptown Races off of a Chet album. And it took me, you know, a month of doodling around and everything like that. But by then I was, I was practicing 4 or 5 hours a day. So it gradually all came. I didn't know he used his fingernails. I didn't know he used a thumb pick. I didn't know anything, And so it took me a while to put it all together. But after a while I was doing that style. And that's where the real guitar push came for me. It was here in Chet.
So that actually kind of leads right into the question I had for you, which was about Chet Atkins. For me as a guitar player, finding Chet Atkins and understanding that he was playing these parts together. I remember my brother calling me and saying, "Yeah, Uncle Robert is playing Walk Don't Run, and he's playing the bass and the lead at the same time."
Yeah.
And I was like, "No way, no, you got to have another guitar player."
Yeah.
So. Exactly. Yeah. How do you like to kind of position yourself and record, and do you typically sit like that?
Yeah, well, the thing is, the sitting position, the typical thing is people sit like this. Mm-hmm. And, anytime you have to reach for a chord, you're down like this to get to it, And, I mean, that working so hard to get to everything. So I like to think of it more like it's a cello, with the neck up here. And that I can spread way out without having to hunker down at all. So I can hit that chord without even working at it, in comparison. So I set the heel of my guitar on my leg, and I have this is just it keeps my arm from laying on the top of the guitar, which deadens the sound a little bit. So I have my arm on that and my leg, and I position myself so I can hold it just like that. So I'm not having to hold the weight of my guitar or anything, and I can go, like that, and I play like that all the time. I have one guitar that actually has a knee cut out of the bottom of the guitar, so it actually sits on my leg better, and makes it come down a little bit more, and the whole thing is just a little bit better. But Dave Bertoncini built me a custom guitar that has that feature even,
Wow.
But,
Now I've noticed this guitar here has just an incredible amount of projection in the room we're sitting in. When you first started playing, obviously it helps the way you play and your attack and everything. Of course, that's in the fingers as well.
Right.
But there's a ton of projection. It's a beautiful sound. Now, have you found that you gravitate towards certain guitars, and that do you play differently if you play an electric versus an acoustic?
Oh yeah, well, like an electric guitar is like playing. Outside of the house with the guitar on the inside. I mean, it's like, it's kind of an out of body experience a little bit to me, because like with this, I play a chord, I hear it come right out of the guitar, and I can feel the vibration on my chest and everything. On an electric guitar, it makes almost no sound in and of itself, and you're hearing the sound coming out from Mars over here from your amplifier, and I don't get much of a kick out of playing electric guitars, although I'll have to say, when I first started, all of my early playing from 66 to 76 was all electric guitar, because in those days you couldn't play out with an acoustic guitar because there was no way to amplify them. And I'm not like knocking electric guitars, but for me personally, I only use them when that's the sound I'm after, but like if you're trying to get some down and dirty sound or string bending and all that, electrics are great. Nylon string guitar is really good for bossa nova music and things that are, Latin or Spanish sounding, Spanish classical music, flamenco music. That all sounds right on a nylon string guitar. I have a resonator guitar that I use for single note lines an awful lot, and it's like listening to an alto woman singing with soul. It's just got this. I don't know. It sings. That's the best word I can use for it. And so every instrument has something about it that's interesting. I have what I call a baritone high string guitar, which is tuned completely different than a standard guitar, and I can do things on it that nobody can do on any other guitar. Like it's that narrow little window. It's really great at. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, I've got a 1923 Gibson L3. which sounds just great if you're doing "I don't want to set the world on fire." If you're trying to do one of those old tunes that sounds like they're sung through a megaphone, I mean, that is the guitar for it. So, the guitar that you're playing does kind of help dictate the style that you play. What I like about this particular guitar is that I can do just about everything on it. It's like I like the way a bossa nova sounds on it. I like the way a folk song sounds. I like the way jazz sounds. So I like a lot of it. And I'll just mention, this is a Paul McGill Super Steel, and it's a pretty expensive guitar, but there's reasons for it. You can see the side and back are made out of myrtle wood and stuff. It's kind of unusual for woods and all that stuff, and the cutaway, and all that. And it's got a porthole here and a preamp built into it and all that. Got an excellent pickup system in it that he makes himself now. But the most interesting thing about this guitar is that there's kind of a block up here for the neck and a block down here for the butt end of the guitar. And anyway, there are two rods that run down, and they're about 3/4 inch size wood rods that connect the two. And what that does is it makes the guitar kind of like a neck through the body guitar. The all the way from the head of the guitar clear to the heel of the guitar is all vibrating together. And because these rods don't connect to the top of the guitar, they're just suspended in there. And so what happens is it takes the stress off of the top of the guitar for having to brace it extra heavy, because it's, and so the bracing system is altogether different and everything. So that volume you're hearing, and another thing that I like about it is, like, normally if you get up into this area of an acoustic guitar, they sound all winky tinky sounding. They stink, ding, 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 but listen to the tone. And I don't know if you can hear it, but like...
Oh, man, those harmonics.
It just every note is still ringing,
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's
wow.
That's
incredible.
It's a nutty guitar, it's just got a lot. And so what I felt like when I first picked this thing up, and it's been 10 years ago now, but when I first picked this thing up, I felt like I had been trying to find the ideal spinet piano all my life, and then somebody laid a baby grand on me. I mean, it was like that. It's just like, holy moly, this thing, there's just no ceiling to it,
I love how you kind of do forays into a lot of jazz stuff, but you've got all this chord knowledge, and then keeping things going with the bass and the lead going on at the same time.
Yeah.
But you also You kind of took something that in the fingerstyle world I hadn't heard as much just personally, and you really jumped into kind of the bossa nova thing. Can you tell me a little bit about that and how that came to be?
Well, when I was maybe, a couple of years after I was working on the Chet stuff, I was also starting to listen to Howard Roberts and Joe Pass and all these jazz guys and everything. And what interested me about them, I loved the swing feel, but I particularly loved the chords. The chord harmonies are so much richer than the three chords I'd been playing, And so I got into doing chord substitutions, and I started that in... I don't know, 66 or 7 or something like that, and I'm still at it. I came up with one a couple of days ago, a new arrangement of a tune. But, it's just, at this moment, by the way, I teach Skype students and everything all across the country, and I happened to look in my tab folder. I've got 1,310 of them. Tab arrangements that I've written out for students.
Wow.
That's been in the last 15 or 18 years or something like that.
Wow.
But anyway, there's a lot of them. And I'm writing new ones all the time for people. So yeah. But the bossa nova, getting back to that, the swing thing, I loved that, and doing like. and that sort of thing, keeping a walking bass and all that sort of thing grabbed me for a while. But I'll never forget the day I first actually heard a bossa nova or paid any attention to it. It was a little late. I mean, it started in the late 50s, kind of, and by 64 or 5, it was a happening thing. But I hadn't heard it, and I was going down the road one day. At that time I was 16. I had a Chevy Impala, a 1960 Chevy Impala, with the sideways fins, and all that stuff. I was driving down the road going home one day, and something came on the radio that I never heard anything like before, and it caused me to slow way down so I could actually hear the thing, and just take it in. I practically pulled off the side of the road, and it ended up being Sergio Mendes and Brazil 66 doing "The Look of Love," and that the look of love, and that bossa nova feel and everything. And I went, holy moly, what is this? And so I went out right away and bought a couple of Sergio records, and then that led me to Jobim, and that led me to everybody, and I got into the whole bossa nova thing. And to this day, I don't think there's any finer form of music from the 20th century than the bossa nova, because it has the richest chords, and they're more unusual than even jazz chords, because they have, lines that go like... they have these crawling kind of lines, and they're weaving in and out of each other, and bass lines that go chromatically downhill and all that. Anyway, all that stuff started getting to me, and I became a bossa nova freak, and to this day, I still love the Chet thing, and I love the swing thing and all that. But if I had to play any one form of music for the rest of my life, it would be the bossa nova. I just love that stuff.
That's amazing. And you've put out materials, tab books and
Right.
albums that kind of have all sorts of genres on that. But I've noticed that one's pretty special to you.
Yeah.
And it is incredible. Did want to kind of ask a couple questions a little bit about, the process or what have you. When you've taken some songs that are traditional melodies that we've heard for years. One for instance, probably the second I had heard from you was the Wayfaring Stranger, actually. And that one, that's all over the map with a bunch of awesome, chords and chops. So when it comes to arranging a song or composing, do you kind of have these ideas in your head, or are you working them out on the guitar, or what?
I usually don't have much of anything in my head when I start. I just start playing the guitar, and I'll start with the chord progression itself. Chords are kind of the center of all of it for me. And so I'll start with the chord progression, and like on that one, for example, the introduction goes... And those are all like 11th chords. This is F over G, or you could call it G 11th, or whatever. And I'm just walking my way up the neck. But I love that sound. It's strange, it's odd, but I liked it. And
so, John, I've been lucky enough to know about your guitar playing, see you live in concert, and it was a pleasure to play with you and at that concert with John Knowles.
Yeah.
But I do want to know, in this whole kind of fingerstyle world and guitar coming from back in the day, CDs, cassettes, and records and such. Now we're in this online world, of course, YouTube and streaming and all that. But I did notice that you'd gotten some videos on YouTube early and built a website and all those sort of things. How did that kind of come about?
Well, that is interesting. It's like back when I was growing up, instrumental music was a big thing. I mean, you could name 50 instrumentalists that were world famous, at any given moment. And now there's hardly any, it's kind of gone away. And back in those early days, you know, if you were Elvis or anybody below him, you know, you went out and played in front of people to sell your records. You know, so like the concerts were, you know, cheap, and they would sell a whole pile of records everywhere they went. You know, and nowadays records ain't worth anything. I've got a stack of CDs at home. I use them to level chairs. You know, I mean, that's all they're good for anymore. And in the meanwhile, you know, now that they're giving away the music, the concert tickets are $400 or $500 or $600 a seat. You know, so it's completely flopped since I started. But at any rate, the online thing, what happened was I had been working in music stores, and I've been doing guitar tech setup work and all that kind of stuff for a long time. I still do that sort of thing. You know, I still work on guitars for people and stuff. I particularly specialize in action setups, anything that has to do with how a guitar plays. Yeah. You know, I'm really into that. But at any rate, back when this whole thing got going with the internet and all that, I was trying to get out of the music store business, and my kids by then were, you know, about to graduate high school, and they were along around that age, and I figured I could venture out and be a guitar player again, because I'd been working in music stores for like 17 years or something, you know, and so I developed this thing called the Praise Guitar Workshop, and what it was it was a Christian outreach program that allowed me to travel around the country and teach, you know, worship guitar players how to do a better job, because I thought, you know, worship music at that time was pretty acoustic guitar driven. This is in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, you know, and but you know, they seemed to not know more than a half a dozen chords and strummed all the time. They didn't finger pick at all. I mean, there was just a lot lacking in it, and I felt like if you're going to do music for the Lord, it ought to be the best.
Absolutely.
And so I set around to try to change all of that, and I traveled around the country to churches, and I would get classes of 20 or 30 people at a church, you know, anywhere in the country. I went as far as Vienna, Austria, doing this. And anyway, I had an 8-hour program that took place on Friday night and most of the day Saturday. So it was a big deal, and it came with a big thick book and a CD and all of that, of all of the things, you know, and people would have to practice all this stuff for a month after I left, you know, to actually get it all down. But it showed them everything about chord substituting and about finger picking and about doing this and doing that and doing bass lines and lead lines and, you know, just everything to try to improve music at church. So anyway, in 1995, I just quit my job at the music store and blasted out trying to do this. Well, before I did it, I had somehow the other people needed to know about it all around the country. You know, I mean, I couldn't just do it at home. And so that's what spurred me. I developed a website called praiseguitar.com. And later on, you know, 20 years later, I also came up with johnstandefer.com. Yeah. And Praise Guitar now is going away. But at any rate, for a lot of years, you know, 10 or 11 years or something like that, I traveled all around doing those kinds of things. And so that's what really got me into it. And, you know, by then, even before I started in 94, I had put out my first book through Mel Bay and all that. So I needed to have a place, a billboard, you know, a national billboard. So the website, I started talking to web people and everything right away and got going on it early. And now it's like every recording that I have, including all the singles that I put out recently and everything, you know, you just got hundreds of tunes that are all out on every streaming device there is. And you know, so I'm giving away my music like everybody else. And I might add, I'm finally at the point, after all these years of doing it and trying to promote it somewhat, I'm actually making a little side living from that. So that's a wonderful thing. You know, it's kind of like a little nest egg that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
Absolutely. And by the way, if you haven't already, Spotify, Apple Music, all the different places that you can, you can find John Standefer and listen to his music. Can you tell me a little bit about the competitions and how you prepare for those and play for them?
Well, my thought was, and you've mentioned this already, that one of my high points is that I'm versatile. Mm-hmm. I can play a lot of different kinds of music. So to do one of those contests, you end up having to play 4 tunes. You play 2 tunes, and everybody and their dog plays 2 tunes. It takes hours, and then at the end of that, they come up with the top 5 people, and you have to play 2 tunes again, different ones. So I had to have 4 songs, and so I picked an original tune. I picked a hillbilly tune, I picked a Chet Atkins tune, and I picked a jazz tune. And, that way, I figured I was covering all my bases. Mm-hmm. What I didn't know at the time was that the judges are in a separate building. They can't see or hear you. They don't know who you are. They'll just say number 7, and you're not allowed to talk. If you say a word, you're disqualified.
Oh, wow.
So, it's supposed to be a really blind, judging thing. And so I played the first 2 tunes, and they didn't know it was me playing the other 2 tunes. They had no idea of the versatility. So that didn't quite work out. But the one tune that I did do was The Man of Constant Sorrow, which was the one that probably actually won it, the last tune that I played. And I took it from Oh Brother Where Art Thou, and just made it my own, and just kind of beat the snot out of it, and beating and twanging in every way I could, to do it. But all 4 of those tunes, I worked them out months in advance, and I did it this way, and I did it that way, and I picked what I thought was the best, and it gradually honed into the arrangements that I actually used. Yeah, this is a little Beatles tune that for somehow, I wasn't a big Beatles fan when they were out, and this was on the flip side of some record that I never heard, so I came onto this late. But at the time, it was Paul McCartney's favorite tune. It's called I Will. And, I kind of Standeferized it a little bit.
That's beautiful. John, not only the fingerstyle stuff. My Uncle Robert used to always bring up when he'd see, we'd watch a concert of yours, but you also had these lead lines, single string lines. You'd be playing a fingerstyle thing, and then maybe I think I saw you with Pat Kirtley, was it? And so, maybe he'd take a rhythm, and all of a sudden you'd go into this single string lead line. Now, you're not necessarily always playing with a thumb pick or a flat pick either.
No, and in fact, I haven't used a thumb pick at all today. I don't use one much anymore. If I'm doing Chet stuff, I need to have a thumbnail growing out of the side of my thumb to get that tick, 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 that sound. So I use the thumb pick for that. But I don't hardly use them for anything else. I like just the... just a, You know, that sound it does more for me than the thumb pick. But you know, there are certain things that the thumb pick really helps out on.
Yeah, and it kind of almost has like a stand-up bass sound to it or something when you're doing that. It's yeah.
Well, and I do a lot of stuff where you know, and I'm getting underneath and popping bass strings and stuff like that.
You got a slap bass player right there. Well, John, I really appreciate you coming out to my little home studio, hanging out with Larry and I, and really appreciate it. And again, you can find John Standefer's music on all sorts of streaming platforms. And he also does have a YouTube channel as well with some classics on there. You know, I'll see you in my dreams.
And there are a few things on the YouTube channel. There's some educational stuff about talking about like how to string your guitar and how to do this and how to do that. You know, there's it's a little bit more educational. So.
And are you still offering lessons and doing repair stuff?
Awesome. Still doing all that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again, John. Appreciate it.
You bet.